Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Planetary Pause series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today I'm delighted to welcome journalist extraordinaire Thom Hartmann. He is the quintessential progressive talk show host, and his daily 3-hour radio TV show is syndicated nationwide and internationally, available in Europe and Africa. He reaches over 500 million homes worldwide. And as a journalist, Hartmann has covered many international hotspots, including the Philippines, Egypt, Uganda, Colombia, and India. He has helped set up hospitals, famine relief programs, schools, and refugee centers in these and other places. He is also a psychotherapist, which I'm going to call on that part of you today, Thom, and licensed NLP trainer, and has written books on ADHD, in addition to his many politically oriented books. On this program, we're going to feature Hartmann's new book, The Hidden History of Big Brother in America. And while we're on that, I want to recommend to everybody that you get the entire Hidden History series by Thom Hartmann. This will give you a comprehensive dive into not only America's current state, but the little known details of our history and how they inform where we are today. So I think we all need to systematically read every book in that series, Thom, and become proficient in their content. So Thom is also the author of The Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, Unequal Protection, Screwed, The Uncharted War Against the Middle Class, and many others. So welcome, Thom. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you, Georgia. It's great to see you again. It's great to be back here with Praxis Peace, and nice to see some old friends. I see Fran there, and I saw Jonathan Freeman and Sergio, people that we've hung out together at your conferences with.
That's right.
And hi to everybody else.
And probably we wouldn't be able to do this if we were trying to do it live.
Yeah.
I mean, in person. So before we get into the main thrust of your book, I want to go into something that you mentioned at the beginning that I think is a good context for what's happening with the Big Brother aspects of our data collection. So I want to begin with some history that you wrote about, notably the role that the Puritans played in suppressing democracy. And you noted that, quote, Puritans were enforcing a social order designed to control religious thought and behavior, and that churches, pastors, and priests were really the big brother of their day. And this seems to be a repressive part in our American past that has never gone away, but has found new ways to suppress democracy and the democratic impulse. So before we get into the types of surveillance that could or might doom us, I'd like you to comment on this history and how we might overcome the tendency to seek out the big brother that really is a problem if you're going to have a democratic society.
Yeah, we're talking about, in a way, authoritarianism, and certainly in this particular instance, theocracy, as that particular form of authoritarianism. In writing this book, I wanted to do a deep dive into both government Big Brother, which is what George Orwell wrote about, and also corporate Big Brother, which is a relatively, well, I was going to say a relatively recent phenomena, but we've had company towns forever, so it's not all together. But the instance that you're talking about, the two big examples from our past, two times when the United States was essentially, or parts of the United States, they were both regional, was a police state where the thought police, as it were, ruled. One was the slavery era in the South, and for several hundred years before that, and the other was the Puritan era in the Northeast. And this, I opened the book with this story of an actual instance that happened that John Greenleaf Whittier turned into a poem, the day the women came from Dover, or the women who came from Dover, something like that. And it was the story of, back at that time, if the Puritans were running the show in Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire, and that's why Ben Franklin left Massachusetts at the age of 17 and moved to Philadelphia. And you had to pay taxes to the local church. You had to show up on Sundays. If you didn't, you could be punished. And there were these three women who were Quakers, and they defied the local pastor in Dover, New Hampshire. His name was, literally, this was his name, Hate Evil Nutter. And it was his real name. And Hate Evil Nutter was very, very angry with these women and that they had defied his religious authority. So he got the local constable and ordered that they be stripped naked to the waist, tied by their wrists to the back of a horse cart. This was the dead of winter. There was 3 feet of snow on the ground, whipped until they were bloody, and then dragged by the wrists to the next town where they would again be whipped until they were bloody all over again. And then to the next town after that. I think it was the 3rd or 4th town where the constable put an end to it. But it was a relatively famous incident that Whittier turned into a poem. That's an example of Big Brother. I mean, writ large. And we still have those impulses. We're seeing it right now in the religious folks that they would call themselves around the country, who want to put women in prison for example, Missouri. They're talking about putting women in prison for receiving birth control pills through the mail. The birth control pills like morning after pills that can induce an abortion or prevent conception. And this effort to ban hormone-based birth control and all that kind of stuff, kicking us back to the 60s. But I'll get into that in a little bit. But I think that was our first experience of that, and it so informed many of the founders, particularly Franklin, but others who were well aware of what was going on in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, that they wrote the separation of church and state, not in those words, but they wrote it into the First Amendment, and they wrote it also into the Constitution itself, in as I recall, 2 different places. So here we are.
I wanted to get a little background on that. Now I want to go to the type of data that is collected on us, not just from Facebook and social media platforms, but also our online purchases, sites we visit, and how the difference in prices even for different customers based on the data that's collected on us that you mentioned, and how most of our private information can be used against us in so many ways. I'd like you to just go into a little bit of the behind the scenes that people may not know about their data collection and what it's doing.
Sure. There are, the data industry has become absolutely massive. Back in the 70s and in the 90s, when I was a partner in the 70s and the owner of an ad agency in the 90s, when I was in that business, there were data companies out there. We used to, in the 90s, the company that I owned, we used to drop about 2 or 3 million pieces of mail every month. And we would buy mailing lists, and we could buy mailing lists of people who subscribed to a particular magazine, or people who lived in a particular zip code, or people who had an income over a certain amount or below a certain amount. But they were fairly general things, and it was common knowledge that information was out there. Now the information that's being collected about us is far more granular. Some of these data companies that are selling our information claim to have 15, 20, 25,000 individual data points on us. And those individual data points, down to, whether you're allergic to cats, or whether you're afraid of spiders, or, what kind of relationships you've had in your life, or where you've worked, or what your finances are, at a super micro level, basically everything you've ever purchased, or at least, in the last 10, 15 years. Those super fine data points can be used basically from behavioral modification. They were used in the 2016 election campaign, the Trump campaign, and Cambridge Analytica were producing, and also in the 2018 campaign by Ted Cruz, who also hired Cambridge Analytica. They didn't get blown up until around 2019. And, they were producing, on one day, they produced over 150,000 different variations of a single ad, encouraging Black people not to vote for Hillary Clinton, and weak Democrats, trying to convince them that both parties are equally corrupt and why even bother voting. And that was very, very effective. If you can get a customized ad to you that's got your cat's name in it, or if you're afraid of spiders, a spider comes down when Hillary Clinton's picture comes on, or whatever. And we really don't know how these, exactly all the details of what was done. These appeared on Facebook and then they disappeared. And outside of Facebook, there's no record of them, and Facebook hasn't been revealing them. But literally 10, 15, 20, on some days, 50,000 different ads, highly customized ads were going out every day. Trump won Wisconsin, for example, by 24,000 votes. And one of the things we know is that this campaign heavily focused on Wisconsin, on all the swing states, the ones that he won by a whisker. And just in Milwaukee, the number of Democratic voters dropped by over 50,000 in 2016 compared to 4 years earlier and compared to years before that. So it was a very, very successful campaign. It was also a very successful campaign for Ted Cruz in 2018. After the revelations came out, Cambridge Analytica kind of shut down and went away. But the business of collecting our personal data and using that to try to alter our behavior, way even beyond just selling us products, but most of it is focused around selling us products or causing us to want to buy products, is far more extensive than most Americans realize.
The behavior modification aspect is something that's very worrying. And I think we have seen lots of it happening where people self-censor themselves by the kind of information they're receiving. They think if they think a little bit differently, they should not say anything. So there's this yeah, go ahead.
It's called social cooling. And it's something that we all know about, even if we'd never even thought about it. If you've ever owned a pet, the cat doesn't jump up on the kitchen counter when you're in the kitchen. It's not just humans who change their behavior when they know that they're being observed. And but we definitely do it. And so there are some of these surveillance programs where they actually want you to know that Big Brother is watching. Mm-hmm. In the hopes that that will cause you to alter your behavior. There's a debate about to what extent this is, really and truly a horrible thing or a good thing, or could be used as a good thing. I mean, in some ways you want people who might think about selling child porn or drugs on the internet to know that that's a high risk venture, because the level of examination and the granularity of the ability of big companies to know what you're doing is massive. On the other hand, trading that off for, and that's always the argument that's made. It's almost always about child pornography or drugs. Trading that off for privacy is, a debate that we really haven't had in this country, and we need to. They've had this debate now in Europe, and the European Union has come up with some real significant regulations on this sort of stuff.
Yeah,
but we have not.
I want to go back a little bit to the election of 2016 and how both Russia and Cambridge Analytica, with input from Steve Bannon, who was very involved in all of that. Do you think that kind of thing is happening again in 2022 for our election in November? And again, might it happen in 2024? And what are the indications that it is going on right now, if there are any?
Yeah, it is. They're using quote free media, social media by and large. The Russian trolls were amplifying the Cambridge Analytica message in 2016 that why bother voting. In fact, that's the Mueller report identified that as the main message that the Russian troll farms were putting out to American voters in 2016. Was both parties are equally corrupt. Mm-hmm. And I know, I get people who call into my program with those memes, and I know where they got them, and it's also not true, but that's their main meme. And yes, we're very much seeing this. I think in this context, it's worth pointing out how extraordinarily unregulated social media is in the United States. Mm-hmm. There is a doctrine. It's sometimes referred to as the Castle Doctrine, as a phrase that came into vogue in the 1300s, but it really goes back to the 1100s, back to the days of the Magna Carta. There's a doctrine that says that your home is your castle, but the flip side of that is that you also have responsibility for what happens in your home. Not only do you have the right to protect it, thus the stand your ground laws, being the theoretical logical extension of that. But also, if you were to put a sign out in front of your house on a Saturday night that said "Big party, everybody welcome," and leave the front door wide open and just sit there in your living room as any old person came in and did whatever they wanted, and you ended up with just absolute craziness going on that by 2 o'clock in the morning in the back room, there's somebody, beating the crap out of somebody. And over in the other room, they're shooting up heroin. In the kitchen, they're selling illegal pornography, and the police were to walk in. All those people, of course, could get busted for the crimes that they were committing, but you would be too, because it was your home and you allowed it to happen. You invited them in, you didn't stop them, you didn't report them to the police. I mean, this is just literally for 1,000 years. This has been a widely accepted part of civilized society. And it doesn't just apply to people in their homes, it applies to businesses as well. If Home Depot was to open the store some Saturday night and just throw a wild party and all kinds of criminal activity was happening, Home Depot could be held responsible. The individual manager who made the decision could go to jail. Home Depot itself could face huge fines. And this is not to pick on one company, but just, they've got big enough stores that they could do this kind of thing. So in their infinite wisdom in 1996, Congress passed an update to the Telecommunications Acts that date back to the 1920s. This was called the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and it had a part in it called Section 230 that said that, it's still true, you're responsible for what happens in your home or in your business if it's physical. But if you build a home on the internet, and you invite in drug dealers, you invite in rapists, you invite in child pornographers, you invite in terrorists, you invite in arms dealers, and they're conducting that sordid business in your home on the internet that you built, and you're watching it happen, and you're not doing anything about it. You have absolutely no liability. You cannot be arrested, you cannot be fined, you cannot be held responsible, you can't be sued, you have complete immunity. And the consequence of that is, what we today call social media. And within a few years, Mark Zuckerberg became one of the richest people on earth. This is not just a concern from a liberal talk show host. I wrote a book about this, obviously, but another reasonably good book about this topic, although the last half of the book is mostly, talking about how liberals are secret communists. But it was written by Josh Hawley. He wrote a book about this topic as well. And it's, when you see Josh Hawley and Ron Wyden agreeing, the Section 230 needs to be reformed, that there's a serious problem.
That's interesting. I wanted to go to something else that you wrote about in your book, that under Trump's 4 years as president, there was no cybersecurity coordinator. So all hell could break loose in the cyberspace, and it did. So you mentioned that in those 4 years, without any oversight, Russian hackers were able to embed themselves in computer systems in the Treasury and the Department of Commerce, and who knows how many other departments, maybe the defense. Do you have any update on that, or any details on that kind of embeddedness?
I don't, and I just, I finished this book maybe 8 months ago, the final edits on it, and I was still looking. The Biden administration has been very, very tight-lipped about this, and that's probably wise. But just to tell a little bit of backstory, if I may, in 2010, we released, Israel and the United States released the Stuxnet virus or worm on Iran and destroyed their centrifuges, stopping their nuclear program. Iran's cybersecurity budget that year was $76 million. The next year, their cybersecurity budget was $1 billion. They hired over 130,000 programmers, and they became the 4th largest cyber army in the world. And then they decided to start putting it to use. Shelley Adelson in 2011, as I recall, had made a comment in a public speech he gave that if Iran kept misbehaving and threatening Israel, that somebody should just drop a nuclear weapon in the desert outside Tehran. And so when he came back to the Sands Hotel, which he owned, Shelley Adelson, the billionaire Republican mega Trump donor, every computer in the Sands, one day, every computer in the Sands was bricked. They completely destroyed. And all the monitors just had a screenshot that was a picture of Adelson and Netanyahu with a slogan in front of flames, with a slogan that said, "Don't let your tongue cut your throat." That was kind of a shot across the bow. Then they decided that they were going to punish the United States. And so they identified a dam here in Oregon. It's the Arthur Bowman Dam. It's upriver of a town called Pineville. And if that dam were rapidly opened, it could have killed over 1,000 people, swept homes away, just, created massive devastation. They thought they had hacked the Arthur Bowman Dam in Oregon. Instead, they hacked a Bowman Dam in New York State, which only dammed up a small stream. And but it got widely publicized. This, when they tried to take this dam down, and this caused the Obama administration to go into code red. And the administration proposed legislation to require all the for-profit companies in America that own our infrastructure. It used to be most of our utilities were publicly owned prior to the Reagan administration, but we had this massive neoliberal privatization wave that started in the 80s. Now more than half of our water companies, our electric companies, our septic systems, virtually all of our nuclear power plants, our regular power plants, our electrical transmission systems are privately owned. And so the legislation would have required all those privately owned companies that owned and administered our critical infrastructure that could lead to the deaths of Americans if it failed, required them to harden their internet infrastructure so that they could withstand an attack from Iran. That legislation passed the House, but it was blocked in the Senate by Republicans who were echoing the libertarian line that this is not the appropriate function of government to be telling private companies what to do. And so as a result of that, Obama started an Office of Cybersecurity within the White House with an executive order. And he had 22 employees, as I recall, maybe it was 24, and a guy named Daniels was running it. And they were doing a really good job. I mean, they were keeping people out and keeping stuff up. And they also opened an Office of Cybersecurity within the Department of Homeland Security, or beefed it up. That dated back to 9/11. So, or the creation of DHS after 9/11. And so when Trump came in, he fired Daniels, he laid off the 20 some odd people, closed the offices over in the Eisenhower office building right next door to the White House. And like you said, Georgia, for 4 years, there was basically nobody minding the door. And by the time Trump left, we had discovered, and it wasn't even the government that discovered it, it was a private security company, discovered that the Russian government was inside the Commerce Department, was inside the Treasury Department. And they couldn't tell if they were inside the Department of Defense. And nobody has said, one way or the other since then. I mean, just those two major departments were shocking enough. And in his last, at the end of his administration, Trump even fired Chris Krebs, the guy who was in charge of the DHS cybersecurity office, fired him too. So Trump did everything he possibly could to hand America over to Russia. I mean, he really, really went out of his way to do that. And we're still suffering from it.
And that was one of my last questions I wanted to ask, was the possibility of cyber war. I mean, right now we're very focused on the possibility of nuclear war because of what's happening in Ukraine, which is horrific. But at the same time, we have this other pathway to war, which is cyber war. And how that might play out depends on how much they've infiltrated our systems. And not just Russians, but even people in our own country who would hack. Trump supporters might do the same thing. It's what kind of protections do we have?
They're fairly minimal. I mean, there's still no requirement for corporations to harden their cyber structures, although the North Korean extortion, the ransomware attacks have probably done more than anything to cause corporate America to take this kind of stuff seriously. But in the book, there's a whole chapter about when Russia declared a cyber war on Ukraine. This was the first time. This was back in 2014. And, they bricked about 10% of all the computers in the country. They shut down all the banks. They shut down all the ATMs. You couldn't get gas from a gas station. You couldn't buy things in stores. Many of the bank accounts were wiped out and people literally never were able to, recover their money. It was a disaster. They shut down the entire government of Ukraine. And I'm amazed that in this conflict, they haven't been able to pull off the exact same thing. I'm just amazed by that. Ukraine learned from the lesson and they did the opposite of what Trump did. They got ready for the next time around. But that's how they would do it. They would shut down your utilities. They would kill off your private companies. They would, turn off the water and the power. And here in the United States, we're sitting ducks, frankly.
Well, that was the kind of the last thing I wanted to ask you about this was the antitrust laws that have been just kind of eviscerated. And we had them in place between the 1890s and the 1970s, as you wrote in your book, but that during the Reagan administration, there was no enforcement really of these. So today we have these mega corporations that for just a few in the media, what are there, 5 major media companies? I mean, we have such a concentration of power in very few businesses. Is there any way out of this? Because it seems like they can gang up and lobby in a way that they're invincible.
Well, the problem that has brought us this essentially oligarchy and monopoly, and I deal with this in 2 of my other books, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy and The Hidden History of Monopoly in America, is that, is this combined thing. In 1983, Reagan told the Commerce Department and the Department of Justice to stop enforcing the antitrust laws. Robert Bork's writings from the 60s and 70s arguing that antitrust laws should only affect the price of consumer goods, that no other consideration should be taken, were adopted by the Supreme Court throughout the mid-'80s. And so now it would be a real challenge to take on any of these giant monopolies. But there's not a single industry left in America that is not now dominated by fewer than 6 companies. Well dominated, like more than 70% dominated, which is pretty much the definition of at least oligopoly. But when they act together, it's a functional monopoly. And then on top of that, the Supreme Court, most recently in 2010 in Citizens United, although it really goes back a bit, it goes back to the 70s, but the Supreme Court ruling that private corporations have the rights of persons, and as among those rights is the First Amendment right to free speech. And if a corporation wants to pour money down the throat of a politician to the point that that politician basically does nothing but the bidding of that corporation, that is no longer considered political corruption or bribery. It's now considered free speech. And so you get, Kirsten Sinema taking $1 million worth of advertising from the big pharma industry, and then she votes to prevent Medicare from being able to negotiate drug prices. You get Joe Manchin taking more money from fossil fuels than any other person in Congress, and blowing up Build Back Better, which had $500 billion for greening the economy. The corruption is so severe now in the United States. We are much closer to being the kind of oligarchy that Russia is right now. And frankly, we would be a hell of a lot closer had Trump prevailed in 2020, because he had made very clear what his intentions were. End the free press, the fake news out there, the enemies of the people, he called them, the media. I mean, this is the kind of rhetoric that you got out of Stalin and you're getting out of Putin now. But between the Supreme Court's decision that money can own politics, and the fact that money has been concentrated into so few hands, and then compounded by Reagan dropping the top income tax rate from 74% down to 25%, and the top corporate tax rate from 51% down to 20%. And they're both functionally way lower than that right now. You've got billionaires who are paying an average of 3% income taxes, according to ProPublica. We've got a serious challenge to even the idea of a highly functioning democracy in the United States.
Yeah, you mentioned something in the book that I thought was quite striking, your time in Singapore. And you said that when you arrived, everything looks so beautiful. Everything is very organized and lovely. But actually, it's a well-ordered police state with no freedom of speech, no possibility of disagreeing with the ruling family. And how close do you think we are to something like this, even today? Because I know we have a much better government than if Trump were in power, but we still have this strong right-wing authoritarian movement in our country. So that's going to be my last question before I open it up.
Europe lived through this. Europe saw this happen with Mussolini and Franco and Hitler, and Franco hung on until 74, as I recall. You still had fascist Spain right up until then. They've seen this, and I think that's why there's European countries have not gone, even when they've embraced neoliberalism, even the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher, embraced neoliberalism in 2 years before Reagan came along in 78. That I think that's why they know the dangers. I mean, there was a recent study that was done, or polling that was done, that found that about 6% of Germans, when you test them, give them psychological tests, test out as strong authoritarians, people who would embrace an authoritarian leader. In the United States, it was 26%. In most other European countries, it was between 10 and 12%. And I think it's because, they have in living memory an experience with fascism that we don't have here in the United States. And I'm really worried that we're going to learn the lesson that they learned the same way they learned it, the hard way, by having authoritarians take over their country.
And part of it is Americans are not very well versed in history of our own country and in world history. The lacking of education in history is kind of appalling in America compared to Europeans.
Oh, and a lot of that goes back to Reagan putting Bill Bennett in charge of the education department. Bill Bennett, who came out and publicly said, if you want to cut crime in America, just abort every black baby. I mean, he literally said that and defends it to this day.
Oh my God.
And he basically ended federal support for civics curriculum. So
I remember they took that out. We had it in high school. You probably did too.
Oh yeah, by third grade, I had memorized the Gettysburg Address and the preamble to the Constitution.
I don't think they do that anymore. But what I'm going to do now is open this up for questions from the audience. So if anyone wants to ask something, I unmute when I call on you, and you can put your hand up. Usually the best way to do that is with the automatic hand that goes up on the corner of your screen.
It's under the reactions button.
Oh, yeah, I think it's on in different places on different computers. So, okay, Fran, you want to unmute?
Hi, Thom.
Hey, Fran.
Well, we listen to you every morning, but listening to you now, I'm learning new stuff. So that's amazing.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. So on this privacy stuff, do you have any view about whether different email providers are better or worse? I'm revamping some of the things I'm doing, and it's kind of like Gmail, Outlook, Yahoo. Any of these free ones are any better than any others?
Yeah, great question, Fran. And I see David is there too. Hey, David.
Hi.
My old buddy. I have such a high regard for David Corton and Fran.
And Fran, hello.
We all do.
You better watch out, buddy.
Yeah, I love you both.
For you too.
Thank you. All of basically the cliche, if you're getting something for free, you're the product, is just very true. I mean, all of these companies read your emails, the emails you send and the emails you receive, so that they can optimize your experience. Some of them will even help you finish your sentences.
Yes, absolutely, they do.
And and the main reason is because they're supported by advertising, and they want to know which advertisers to send your way. The only two options that I know of, but I'm not an authority in this area.
Yeah.
The only two options that I know of are, one, Proton Mail, which is
John just put that in the chat.
Yeah, which is a company that offers secure mail, and they don't read your emails and all that sort of thing. And the other is, some of these companies offer enterprise solutions. Google, for example, offers an enterprise solution. It's a form of Gmail. You pay, I think it's like $50 a month per person per month. And you can, and there's no ads. You can turn on or turn off the, auto fill the sentences. In other words, you're basically turning on or off whether their artificial intelligence is going to be interacting with you. But as far as I can tell, they're not gathering your information to sell you advertising, because you're paying them. There's no need to, there are no ads involved. And you can do that with custom domains. So it could be david@davidcorton.com, and you could run that through Gmail. I don't know if Proton Mail offers something similar to that. I don't know what other companies do, but that would be where I would start.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate
I
it.
just wanted to tell Fran and David, because you weren't on the call yet when I mentioned it. After the program today, everyone who's on this program, I'm going to send the radio show that David Korten was on, that Thom Hartmann conducted in Dubrovnik, Croatia in 2007 for our conference there. So I'm going to send everyone a copy of that. It's really wonderful to listen to. So I'm going to call on Jonathan next.
Hey,
Hey,
Thom.
Jonathan. Great to see you.
Yeah, I just wanted to, first off, I love that you mentioned
Actually, John,
proton.
no, it was Jonathan I thought I was calling on.
Oh, yeah, feel free.
Jonathan, were you?
He can go, doesn't matter. I'll
Okay, John, go ahead, and we'll go to Jonathan afterwards.
Yeah, I
Thank
was
you.
just going to ask your thoughts on how we rein in stuff like AI and language models. I don't know how familiar you are with the specific papers that come out, but I follow this YouTube channel that follows cutting edge computer science research. And there are language models now that are so good at producing news articles that were, on average, 50% able to differentiate them between a bot and a human written article.
Right.
Instead of just individual ads, very soon it's going to be entire news articles written to tailored to an individual.
That's
so
correct.
I'm just curious your thoughts. Is it possible to rein, even if we make it illegal, like in the UK, in the Cambridge Analytica books we read, they mention how elections are publicly funded in the UK and what they did was illegal. How do you rein in software that can be deployed from anywhere, that can be, how do you put that cat in the bag?
Yeah, I don't know of any simple solutions. This is, John, and one of these large areas where 20 years ago, we should have been having this conversation publicly and in a robust way, and we failed to. And it's getting more and more sophisticated and more and more powerful, day by day. And I mean, Stephen Hawking, before he died, was warning us about artificial intelligence. In a slightly different context, but this is an area where, because it's transnational, I really think that it requires international regulation. But I don't have any simple answers for this increasingly complex problem.
I think that's a good answer, especially when John said it could be deployed from anywhere. So it does need to be an international solution. So Jonathan, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, I more have a remark. Fran, you said something about all learning from each other. I mean, sitting next to you is the guy who wrote When Corporations Rule the World. And you all know that I've done a lot of work in this area as well. And so one book I wanted to recommend was Ted Mace's Gangs of America.
Yeah.
And as well as an article by actually a childhood friend, Carl Mayer, who talked about how corporations moved from being artificial to natural entities after Santa Clara in 1886. And the other book that I found is really cool is this one's called The Verax. And it's a graphic novel, and it's by a fellow named Pratap Chatterjee and Khalil. And it's all about whistleblowers, drone warfare, and mass surveillance. And he talks about that in the beginning, and then it gets into the whole Edward Snowden thing. It's an incredible outlay of what has gone on in that. And to me, the whole issue is so big, really so big. And just after thinking, what you talked about with Trump, and he lost in 2020. Thank God, but we have these elections coming up. I'm kind of discouraged. It doesn't look good for our wonderful democracy that we have so far that's been so corporatized.
Jonathan, would you put the name of that publication in the chat box?
Yeah, I will do
And I
that.
also want to mention again, Tom's book, Big Brother in America, The Hidden History of Big Brother in America. Readers Books has copies of it in Sonoma. I checked with them yesterday, so you can go pick it up there. Okay, it looks like Mike, you wanted to ask something?
Miguel.
Yeah, but he's Mike, but he calls himself Miguel. Okay, Miguel, habla.
Hey, Mike. Oh, yeah.
Nosotros.
Oh, did I put Miguelito on there? Oh, first of all, it's always wonderful to listen to you. I used to listen to you for years on the radio. I actually haven't recently, but I used to for years. So you can just kind of verify it on the. I just saw the Cambridge Analytica documentary the other night. I think I actually have seen it twice now. But what was really fascinating was how these young people that were involved, I forget their names, but they were, they were big players in this whole thing, and they targeted what they called the persuadables. They got it down to what they called the persuadables, people wishy-washy, who couldn't make up their minds, and about 75,000 of them or so, or maybe it was even less than that, in just about 4 or 5, the swing states, and they, persuaded them, and that turned it. But I mean, because it was so incredibly tight, and of course, I always blows my mind, but I mean, Hillary won the election. Of course, everybody in the world knows that, which leads to my next question. If you have any insight on the fact that they ever in our lifetimes going to get rid of the Electoral College.
Yeah, this is the indirectly, this is the subject of the rant I published today at HARTMANNreport.com, which is the reason that Putin is failing in Ukraine is because he has a deficiency of democracy. When you end up with an autocratic government where you've got a single decision maker rather than the wisdom of the crowd, that wisdom of the crowd gets lost and terrible decisions are frequently made. And history is littered with examples of this. And I think that we've gotten fairly close to that here in the United States on a number of occasions. Most specifically with Donald Trump. Can
I ask just one quick little thing there, if you wouldn't mind, because you said at one point when you were talking that everything that he could do, everything that Trump could do to hand everything over to Russia, as we all heard a lot of it, but the way you just said it, and go find the emails, Russia, and all that stuff. What is this might be a simple question, or everybody knows the answer, I don't know, but why is that? Why is it just because of the dirt they have on him? What is it, the power that he wants? What is the actual reason why he would actually hand our country over to people?
All I can offer you is a theory, but it's an informed theory, and it's based on public sourcing, as it were. And David K. Johnston is probably one of the better sources for this. In 1996, I think it was 96. It was in the 90s when Trump declared his big bankruptcies, when his casinos crashed, and he just got wiped out. He was on the edge of losing everything. And it was, among others, but it was Russian oligarchs who bailed him out. He got a pile of money from Russia. They were laundering basically dirty money through his real estate, at least according to, Johnston and a few other folks. And I think that was the point at which he realized, this oligarchy thing is a pretty cool idea. Democracy is a mess, and they try to regulate me and all this, and real estate is kind of the last frontier of unregulated money in America. It's pretty much the only industry where you can walk in and, with $20 million in a suitcase in physical cash and buy something. And, which happened with Trump. And in fact, he had $20 million properties that he sold to Russian oligarchs for $50 and $60 million, famously. So my sense of it is that between that and the possibility that he could build a Trump Tower in Moscow, which would be the crowning jewel of his empire, and it would be worth $1 billion and could generate hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue for him and cement him as a made man in the Russian mob. Michael Cohen has said that Trump is basically a mobster, and the prince. And while he, up until the 90s, he was principally in tight with the Italian mafia in New York State. It's why he built Trump Tower out of concrete instead of steel, because the chief mobster in New York was in the concrete business. That post 90s, he was in with the Russian mobsters and the former Soviet country, the Kazakhstan mobsters, and et cetera. So I think it was just that simple. I mean, maybe they had something they were blackmailing him with. Maybe they have a PP tape or something. Frankly, I don't think he cares. I don't think he's all that blackmailable. He brags about assaulting women. He's everybody knows he's paid women to sleep with them. so it seems to me that he was just looking at his own financial survival, that he wants to continue to live the lifestyle of a king, this extraordinarily lavish lifestyle. And he thought that the most effective way to do it would be to get in bed with the Russian oligarchs. And the best way to do that was to go to the capo de capo, the oligarch of the oligarchs, which was Putin, and, give him what he wanted.
Do you think Trump is ever going to be held accountable?
I don't know. I think that in April, right now it's tentatively scheduled for April, that the January 6th committee is going to start their public hearings, and they're going to start laying out Trump's crimes.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's very likely, if that doesn't get overshadowed by war or some other event, and I guarantee the Republicans will be doing the best they can to whip up hysteria around something while that's going on. But if they can get that message out to enough Americans, there might be enough political pressure for the Justice Department to really come down on him. But right now it's up to, these two women, two Black women, a prosecutor in Atlanta and Letitia James, the Attorney General for the state of New York, especially now that the DA, the new district attorney in New York City, has wimped out and refuses to tell us why he dropped the case. I mean, his two lead prosecutors are so pissed off by it that they quit publicly. But nobody knows. Alvin Bragg, I think, is his name. So who's going to hold him to account? I don't know. And what kind of pressure can he bring to bear on people, economic, political, or even criminal, threatening families and things? Who knows? I don't know.
It seems like if he's not held accountable and there isn't enough accountability for January 6th, that the Democrats are at a real disadvantage in November.
Well, this is what happened in Russia in the late 90s and early 2000s. As the oligarchs took over, they corrupted the political system.
Right.
The political system then, and the oligarchs became a circular symbiosis where they would, lower taxes and deregulate businesses so that the oligarchs could make more money. They'd recycle part of that money back to the politicians, who would then lower taxes even more and reduce, regulations. We've been seeing that cycle in the United States since the Reagan administration, and it's getting more and more exaggerated every time it kind of loops around. And I don't know what's going to break it. It's why I'm concerned that we're going to have to learn our lesson the way the Germans did.
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to open up a whole can of worms at the end of this, but I don't see any hands up. So I'm curious to ask you about, because you mentioned the cyber.
Linda has her hand up.
Okay, I'm going to go to Linda then. Linda, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask if you knew anything. I heard something on the radio the other day that the oligarchs, Putin was going to give the oligarchs Ukraine, all the people who are leaving Ukraine and get the land cheap and infiltrate Ukraine with oligarchs, is buying up the land. Do you know anything about that? Is that just a joke, or?
I have no idea. I've not heard that, Linda, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. I mean, Naomi Klein wrote a book about it. It's called Disaster Capitalism.
Oh.
When horrible things happen and people are stressed out and at the end of their rope, that's when the disaster capitalists sweep in and figure out how to exploit it.
Yeah.
So it's not incredible. I just don't have any details on it.
Okay, then I'm going to ask this. It kind of dovetails to that. But you mentioned that Russia had committed really cyber attacks on the infrastructure in Ukraine in 2014. And was that in response to, before, or after the US involvement in the coup in Ukraine in 2014? How do those two things fit together?
This was in my recollection. I'd have to go back and read my own book. I wrote this a year ago, and my recollection is not that granular with regard to the timeline. But I believe this was when Paul Manafort's client Viktor Yanukovych got kicked out during the Maidan revolution, and was replaced by Petro Poroshenko, who was sort of like, if you think of Yanukovych as being Trump, a gangster fascist politician, he got kicked out and he got replaced by Mitt Romney. Poroshenko has been doing a lot of hits on CNN lately, and he was a reasonable politician. He was just quite corrupt. He was in tight with the Ukrainian oligarchs. And so then Zelensky came along as the anti-corruption campaigner, and he replaced Poroshenko. But Poroshenko and Zelensky at least believe in democracy. Yanukovych didn't, and my recollection is that this attack was in response to their kicking out Yanukovych. But it could have been. It was also around the time of the Crimea thing. So I might be wrong on that. I'd have to look in my own book and check.
I just know the US was involved in that coup also, but that's a whole other thing that I would like to talk to you about sometime, because I have a slightly different take on it than you do. I'm going to go to Ray.
Yes, hi, Tom. I try to listen to you every day and
Hey, Ray.
feel informed in the result. The question I have is, obviously we're very upset about what's going on in Ukraine and Russian incursion and everything else. How come we weren't that concerned when they did this to Crimea? It's like, it's almost the same thing. It's like, wait till the Olympics are done and then take over a country, or at least part of a country. That's what he did after his own Olympics in 2014. And I'm not seeing the connection. It's like we should have been this upset over that, because it's kind of the same thing.
I don't know the answer to that, but my wife has a theory that the Obama administration just didn't want to rock the boat. That mostly they were trying to keep their heads down and just focus on domestic issues. And I mean, we did sanction a bunch of the oligarchs, and we punished Russia in some relatively small ways. But it seemed like we kind of shrugged it off. And I remember at the time thinking that the story that we were being told about this by Russia, which was that Crimea was historically Russian speaking. Crimea hangs off the southern end of Ukraine the way Florida hangs off the United States. And much like Florida, it's the place where all the wealthy Russians, and particularly the Russian senior military, went to retire, like Florida. And my oldest daughter spent a year studying Russian and Ukrainian in Simferopol in Crimea. And so I have some familiarity with the area. And there are a lot of Russian speakers there. I mean, it's probably more Russian spoken in Crimea than Ukrainian. And so when the story that we got in 2014 was that, Crimea wanted to stay with Russia, there were majority Russian speakers, they held a plebiscite or an election. The Russian speakers said, yes, we want to be with Russia instead of Ukraine, and boom, they did it. I bought it at the time, or at least I thought, if the Obama administration is not going bat guano crazy about this, there must be something to it. And I think the rest of the world sort of did too. I frankly don't know what was going on inside the Obama administration at the time, though.
Yeah, this could open up a whole other thing, which I don't want to get too involved in, because that wasn't the focus of our program today, which is on Big Brother. But I'm going to take a last question from Fran.
Hey, Fran.
This is actually a question from Dave.
Okay, I thought it might be.
Hey, Dave.
What do you see in terms of the situation on this between the US and China? And of course, the discussions this morning, and some of us are hoping that there might be some possibility of common ground between the United States and China, and even around a very positive vision if China were to really pick up on its commitment to an ecological civilization.
Wow, there's a lot there.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah, I would say, first off, we have to realize that China is also an authoritarian government. And so China and Russia are kind of the authoritarian club right now. And China would very much like to lay their hands on Taiwan the same way Putin is trying to lay his hands on Ukraine. And they've got to be watching this very, very carefully. The second data point that I would lay on you is, everybody knows how dependent Germany is on Russian gas and oil. This is one of the legacies of the last 20 years and of Angela Merkel's administration, one of the bad legacies. We are far, 40% of their gas and oil is, and I guess 40% of their oil and almost 50% of their natural gas is coming from Russia. We are even more dependent on China for consumer goods and industrial materials. I mean, walk into any store and just do the thought experiment. Just look around and just ask yourself, if all of the things that were made in China that are in this store were to vanish, what would be left? What would happen to America? China knows that Biden's threats of economic sanctions are hollow. If they were to cut off, our consumer goods, there's no administration that could withstand that. You'd see inflation go into 20, 30, 40%. You would see just massive dislocation, economic dislocation within the United States, supply chains crashing. They supply virtually all of our consumer goods, from toys to clothes to furniture to everything else. So they've got a huge stick. They're just, on the other hand, Xi is also sitting on a powder keg, in as much as, he knows, and this is, within recent Chinese memory, the famines of the 60s and 70s, et cetera. He knows that if he doesn't keep the economy going, if he doesn't provide for his people, that he's going to be toast. His own administration is going to face a crisis. So I think that my sense of it is that he's walking a fine line here. How long he can walk that and where it's going to go, I just don't know.
I just sense that he may have a greater commitment to his people than we have in Russia.
Yeah, I think that's true.
This communist commitment to the world.
Yeah, and I think that's why this morning, one of the first messages that came out of the Putin, or of the Xi Biden phone call, was that China was basically saying, we're not a fan of what Putin's doing in Ukraine, but they haven't yet slapped Putin's hand.
Okay. Well, I think we're at a close to the program. I don't want to, because I know we could go into a whole other phase, which I could take another hour. So, but I really appreciate the answers to your questions and just everything that we've talked about today, Thom. It's wonderful to have you here, and I hope we get you for your next Hidden Series book. Do you know what it's going to be about, the next one?
Yeah, it's in fact, I'm doing the final edits on it this weekend. It's called The Hidden History of Neoliberalism, How Reaganism Gutted America.
Oh my God, I can't wait. I definitely want you back when that one's out. And again, I'll mention we have it at Reader's Books, The Hidden History of Big Brother in America. And I finished it this week, and I highly recommend it, as I do to all the books in your Hidden History series. We had you on the one in Monopoly too.
And you should mention your own book on neoliberalism there, Praxis.
Oh, on Civil Liberties, Deconstructing Libertarianism. Yes, we have our own book that deconstructed it. Thank you for that, Ray. And thank you, Thom. Thom, we're probably going to stop the recording now.